And a warning, this interview has a description of how Jack and Paul were killed, which people may find distressing. Claire, first up, thanks for coming to talk to us today and telling us your story. I want to ask you about the events that led you here, your campaign to try and better protect children from domestic abusers. But let's start with your boys, Jack and Paul. What were they like?
They were the typical boys, very outgoing, confident. It's funny, you bring them up both exactly the same and yet they're so different. Jack was a lot more caring, a lot quieter. Paul was cheeky, full of fun, full of energy. Jack was a musician. He loved music. It ran through his veins like water down a stream, and he played the trumpet. And until he started playing the trumpet, he was quite an introvert, quite quiet boy.
Yeah.
But playing the trumpet absolutely changed his life.
Yeah.
He found that it was okay to try to do something and it's okay to fail. Paul was always trying to be like his brother. Paul was a runner, he was a sprinter. In fact, I think he could run before he could walk. And when you saw him run, it set him free. 150 was his favourite distance. And he loved the glamour of the track, but he used to light up from inside and he'd say, whatever's happening at home on that track, nothing can catch me, nothing can touch me.
And Claire, your boys would have been, Jack would have been 20 now and Paul would have been 17. And do you sort of imagine it that Jack might have been a musician and Paul might have been a sort of a sprinter?
Yeah, their futures were taken away from them, and it's really an open wound that I keep picking, but it's bleeding anyway. I see his friends, and I saw one of Jack's friends the other day and he's got a beard. It's a case of that's what Jack would look like now. All the marks, the proms,
the milestones,
learning to drive, leaving school, going to university, that could have been them, and that should have been them.
Can I go back to, if it's all right with you, to your experience and the events leading up to your boys, losing your boys? You met the boy's father when you were 25, I think. Did you notice any red flags about him back then, or did he woo you and was a very loving partner?
Back when I met him, there were no mention of domestic abuse. The term love bombing, he sent a rose to my works every day for 3 weeks, until I said I'd go out with him.
Okay.
There was something I didn't like about him, and I'd said that I wouldn't go out with him. But you know, after 3 weeks, you kind of feel sort of a little bit special, maybe a little bit more interesting than normal.
Yeah.
Now I would say to any young person that that's actually love bombing and you're being conditioned to be loved.
Well, it's coercive, it's a bit controlling. You left your ex-husband after 16 years. That must have felt like a relief, was it, for you?
Well, to be honest, that's when the danger escalated.
So it wasn't a relief, or for you as well?
For all of us.
Okay.
Because that's when he lost control.
Right.
When...
Of you?
Yeah, and the boys. Because the boys didn't want to see him.
But as you said, the situation deteriorated because the boys had unsupervised visitation with their father, even though you fought that in the court. Can you just explain to viewers what happened?
So in the July, I was forced to go to court and begin residency order proceedings against him. And that's when the fear and oppression just carried on. He was allowed to intimidate me in the court. I had to sit in the same waiting area, and he was sat just across from me. And what people don't realise about family courts is they're not protected like a magistrate's in a Crown Court. And in those courtrooms, perpetrators are allowed to cross-question their victims. And even though he had a barrister there, he hurled insult after insult across that room. It was just a boardroom. I was just 4 seats away from him. And in the second court hearing, he actually went for me. So we had to move away from the doorway. And when we got into the courtroom, the judge said that even though he'd shown and displayed this aggressive behaviour, he still could have 5 hours unsupervised access to his children a week.
So the boys went back, was it to your house?
Yeah,
to the family home?
We'd only been divorced 2 weeks.
Yeah.
By the 22nd of October. And when I walked in, call it instinct, call it worry, I always worried about the boys. I said, the phones are on the table, they need the phones every time they go to see their dad. And she said he was late picking them up today. So I was actually debating about going down there and giving them the phones, and if I had have done, I'd have been able to go in and get them. That haunts me to this day. But instead, I had my tea, and it could only have been 15 minutes. And the doorbell rang. And for some reason, I didn't want to answer it. Call it an instinct, call it a warning. And when I opened the door, there was a local police officer, and he stepped back under the light. And I looked at his face, and the first thing I said was, what has he done? Now, I live in a small village. He knew Jack and Paul. I'd pass them at school. I'd say to him, morning. He'd say, morning. And the look on his face, I knew.
You knew.
And I said, what has he done? And he said, there's been an incident, and you need to come with me now. The boys have been taken to Sheffield Children's Hospital. So I got in the car, and we travelled at about 100 mile an hour to Sheffield Children's Hospital. And he pulled into the square where the resus rooms are, and he said, go, go, go. So I ran in, and the first thing I saw was a medic doing CPR on Paul.
And Paul, who was then 9, your 9-year-old.
And I just remember watching him being bounced off the bed with the force of the CPR's not nice to see or do. And I was dragged literally into a room because I was just ready to run across to him. And a doctor came to me, and I could see with his face. And he said to me, are you their mum? And I said, yes. And he said, I'm very sorry, but we're going to let him go now in your arms. And I said, what do you mean, go? And he said, there's nothing more we can do. So I ran through with him, and I just scooped him up into my arms. And when people say the light goes out of people's eyes, you don't believe it till you see it. And these beautiful blue eyes just looked at me, and they turned grey, and they just looked as if they were looking through me. And I said to him, come on, Paul, you can't leave. Don't do this. Stay. But he'd gone, and the nurse closed his eyes, and I was holding on to him so tightly, and my tears were wetting his hair, and I just sat rocking him. And I weren't screaming because I couldn't talk. The pain was just so intense. There was nothing.
Yeah.
Just this pain and this love. And I said to him that I loved him, and that I promised him that no other child would be hurt by a parent or an adult. And I was still holding him tightly, and the medics came and said, you have to let him go now, he's a crime scene. And they were just the wrong words to say, because he wasn't a crime scene, he was my son, my cheeky
Yeah.
full of energy, running.
Yeah.
Son that I'd just dropped off at school 9 hours earlier, and
For
he
a
looked
normal day.
perfect. He just had a scratch down his nose, and that was from where Jack had pulled him.
They'd pulled him across
the
field.
attic. And he just looked like he was sleeping. And I said to the nurse, "Don't leave him on his own, he's only 9. And the nurse said, "No, I'll sit with him." And then I went over to Jack, and he was still fighting at this point. And they turned around and said to me, "You've got a choice now. We're taking Jack to Manchester. So you either stay and sit with Paul, or you go with Jack to Manchester." It was the furthest they'd ever been apart as brothers. They'd never spent a night apart. They'd never spent more than a few hours apart. We got to Manchester, and Jack held on for 5 days. He was 56% burnt. And details were coming out slow but sure about what had actually happened so that they could piece it together. And they worked out that he'd actually barricaded the property and trapped Jack and Paul in the attic. He was found in one corner of the attic, and Jack had tried to escape. And when Paul fell, he went back for his brother, and he gave his hand in the darkness to his brother, and he used his own strength to pull his brother to the hatchway. And for 5 days, the hospital said I had to talk about Paul as if he was alive, because Jack believed he'd saved his brother. And Jack was only sedated. He wasn't in a coma. He was sedated for the pain.
He must have been in a lot of pain.
And if he knew that Paul hadn't made it, it would affect his recovery.
Yes.
So for 5 days, I sat at his bedside, and you could tell that he could hear, because every time I spoke to him, his heart monitor went right down.
So you just calmed him down, like hearing his mum just calmed him.
And then on the Monday, which was his 3rd operation, it weren't going well. And he'd come out and he was in recovery, but he wasn't recovering. And this nurse came flying down the corridor, and I just ran after her. She didn't even have to say anything. And they started CPR, because with burns victims, the potassium levels in your blood build up, and the potassium stops your heart.
Right, okay.
And Jack's potassium levels was too high, so he just went systolic, so his heart stopped. And again, I watched them perform CPR on him. I knew the longer that they were doing CPR, and God, they tried, that less of Jack would have come back. And if he hadn't have been able to play his trumpet, if he hadn't have been that gentle boy who had the heart and courage of a lion, then who were I bringing him back for? They fought and fought. And again, they turned to me with that look in the face, and they said, "We're going to have to call it." And I scooped him up in my arms. I promised him. I said to him that no more children should have to be killed by a parent. No other child should have to say to a fireman and a doctor and a police officer that their dad had hurt them and they'd done it on purpose. And no more parents would have to end up like me, just existing, just living, not even living. Nobody should have to hold their children in their arms as they die. And their lives were taken because the court said they could. I did everything by the book, played by the rules. I told the court in my application back in July that he was capable of killing the boys. Kafkas, I told them not to see him on their own because when he heard something he didn't like, then he got aggressive. I told social services the same. Kafkas ignored that, and on the Monday before the Wednesday, she had an interview with him in her office, and when she terminated the interview, he barricaded her in the office and refused to let her leave the room. That was never reported, that was never acted on. And had I known that on the Wednesday, then I would have quite happily gone to jail rather than let them go on that visit. And Jack and Paul made 19 children murdered at the hands of a known perpetrator of domestic abuse. And now we're up to 43 children. And it's not even been 10 years. And I promised both of them that they would be the last.
Tell me what your goal is in terms of the next piece of legislation that you feel is necessary to better protect children.
There's a piece of legislation called Practice 12J.
Right.
And it's practice direction for children that are suffering abuse. Now I can hear people screaming it now. If we have to have legislation to protect children who are going through abuse, why not just stop the presumption of contact in the first place? This small piece of legislation underneath the Children's Act was brought in around parental access
Yes.
to children. And in this legislation, it says it's in the child's best interest to see both parents. Now, this obviously needs changing to only if it's in the child's best interest and it's safe to do so. Because Practice 12J is what social services, Kafkas and judges make their rulings on.
Yeah.
Now, there's so much made about parental rights, but there's this deafening silence when it comes to children's rights. And every child's right is to be safe and loved and protected.
One final question for you, Claire. The way you talk about them, it feels to me like they're still with you. They're very much still with you. You feel that, do you? That they are perched upon your shoulders?
The day that I don't talk about them, the day that I don't feel them, that's the day that they die. And I will keep talking about them. And I will challenge every court in this land. I'll challenge every lord, every lady, every baroness, every baronet, every prime minister. I will challenge them all to say that they have done the best that they can to keep every child in this country safe. And not one of them can look at me in the face and say that. And I will carry on asking the awkward questions. I will ask people to sign the petition. I will ask them to sign the campaign, and I will take it back through courts again, and I will take it to the House of Lords again. Because since they ruled that Practice Direction 12J didn't need looking at, more children have died. More. And they could have made a difference to those children. And they have to be held accountable for that. And so far nobody is. So I'm going to carry on, even though it rips my heart in two every day, because they would have stood up and done the same for me. And that's why I carry on in their names.
Well, Claire, thank you. It felt like a real privilege that you shared your story with me and told me about your boys and told us about your campaign. So thank you so much. I'm really grateful. I know that that's not easy. Thanks for telling it.
Thank you.